At first, it was just another forgotten storage unit, dust in the air, rust on the lock, silence heavy enough to feel permanent. Then the door rolled up, and history breathed again. Inside that narrow room in Van Nuys, California, time had not merely stopped. It had been waiting 34 years to remind the world that some Michael Jackson stories refuse to stay buried. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. December 2024 did not begin with headlines about Michael Jackson. It began quietly, with a former California Highway Patrol officer named Greg Musgrove standing in front of an abandoned storage unit. He had opened dozens like it before: furniture, broken electronics, old paperwork, forgotten lives reduced to cardboard boxes. But this one was different from the moment the lock snapped open. Inside were 16 DAT cassettes. Not vinyl, not reel-to-reel, DAT digital audio tape, studio-grade, professional, the kind used in high-end recording sessions in the late 1980s and early 1990s, each cassette labeled in faded handwriting, dates, song titles, initials that made Musgrove pause. MJ. Michael Jackson. At that moment, Musgrove didn't yet understand what he was holding, but the room itself seemed to know. The silence felt charged, as if voices were still suspended in the air, waiting for someone to press play. Those tapes contained 12 unreleased Michael Jackson songs, fully produced tracks, instrumental sketches, vocal takes, and something far more intimate: raw studio conversations between Michael Jackson and a producer named Bryan Loren, creative debates, moments of doubt, laughter, experimentation, the unfiltered mind of an artist at the peak of his powers. Estimated value: $7 million. Time abandoned: 34 years. And yet, none of it could ever be released. To understand why, we have to go back, not to 2024 but to 1990, when Michael Jackson stood at a crossroads. By the late 1980s, Michael Jackson was no longer just a pop star. He was a global institution. Thriller had rewritten the rules of music, fame, and celebrity itself. Bad had proven that Thriller was no accident, but with success came pressure, unrelenting, suffocating pressure to reinvent again. Michael Jackson was searching. He was stepping away from Quincy Jones, stepping into unfamiliar creative territory, looking for new sounds, younger collaborators, producers who didn't fear him, who didn't worship him, who could argue with him in the studio and survive the conversation. One of those producers was Bryan Loren. Bryan Loren was not a household name. He wasn't famous. He wasn't flashy. But he was talented, technically sharp, and unafraid. Between 1989 and 1991, Loren worked closely with Michael Jackson during the early development phase of what would eventually become the Dangerous era. This was not the polished Michael Jackson the public knew. This was a restless artist experimenting with harder beats, darker themes, and socially charged lyrics. The world would later hear echoes of this period in songs like Jam, Black or White, and Who Is It? But what Bryan Loren recorded with Michael Jackson went even deeper, into places the public was never meant to hear. One track, reportedly titled Truth on Youth, featured LL Cool J. Another, Don't Believe It, hinted at Michael's growing paranoia about media narratives years before they would consume him. 7 Digits explored identity, surveillance, and numbers replacing humanity. These were not lightweight pop songs. These were documents of an artist wrestling with his time. And then everything stopped. By the mid-1990s, Bryan Loren vanished from the story. He stopped paying rent on his storage unit sometime around 1997 or 1998. The tapes remained inside. Month after month, year after year, ownership transferred legally under California storage lien laws. Paperwork was filed, locks were changed, and the recordings slipped into legal limbo, untouched, unheard, and slowly forgotten. Michael Jackson moved on, Dangerous was released, then H.I. Story, then Invincible, life accelerated, scandals erupted, triumphs followed, and eventually in 2009 the world lost Michael Jackson forever. The tapes remained. When Greg Musgrove finally listened to them decades later, he understood the gravity of what he had found. These were not bootlegs, not fan recordings, not studio leftovers tossed aside casually. These were master-quality DAT tapes containing pristine audio and conversations no one outside that room had ever heard. Musgrove did what the law required. His attorney contacted the Michael Jackson estate. The response was immediate and devastating. Yes, the estate confirmed the recordings were authentic. Yes, they acknowledged the historical significance. But no, they would not purchase them. And no, they could never be released. Here lies the cruel paradox at the heart of this story. Musgrove legally owns the physical tapes, but the Michael Jackson estate owns the copyrights. Under U.S. copyright law, owning the medium does not grant the right to exploit the content. The music cannot be sold. It cannot be streamed. It cannot be played publicly. It cannot be used in a documentary soundtrack. It cannot even be legally broadcast in full. The tapes are simultaneously priceless and unusable. Collectors would pay millions to possess them privately. Scholars would kill to study them. Fans would give anything to hear Michael Jackson speaking freely in the studio. But legally, the recordings are frozen, like artifacts behind glass, visible but untouchable. And hovering over everything is one unanswered question. What happened to Bryan Loren? Why would a producer walk away from unreleased Michael Jackson songs? Why abandon material that could define a legacy? Why disappear completely? Attempts to locate Bryan Loren have failed. No confirmed public appearances, no interviews, no statements. His name surfaces only in legal documents and liner notes from a vanished era. Some speculate he became disillusioned. Others suggest financial trouble. Some believe creative differences fractured the collaboration beyond repair. But the tapes tell a different story. According to those who have heard portions privately, the conversations between Michael Jackson and Bryan Loren are not hostile. They're collaborative, curious, intimate. Michael is engaged, asking questions, testing ideas, pushing boundaries. This is not an artist dismissing a producer. This is an artist building something with him. Which makes the abandonment even more haunting. These tapes are not just unreleased songs. They are evidence of a parallel creative universe, an alternate Dangerous album that never existed. A reminder that for every masterpiece released, countless others are left behind, sometimes by choice, sometimes by chaos, sometimes by disappearance. The legal battle that followed the discovery was quiet but firm. The estate's position has not changed. They have no incentive to allow release. Doing so would set precedent, open floodgates, complicate control over Michael Jackson's catalog. So the recordings remain sealed by law. And yet, their existence alone has changed how we understand Michael Jackson. They reveal an artist who never stopped working, never stopped questioning, never stopped recording. Even at the height of fame, Michael Jackson was still chasing something just out of reach: truth, authenticity, connection. In that sense, the tapes are not a tragedy. They are a mirror. They show us that genius is not a finished product. It is a process, messy, uncertain, vulnerable. And maybe that's why they can never be released. Because they were never meant to be heard by the world. They were meant for the room. For the moment. For Michael Jackson himself. Today, those DAT cassettes sit carefully preserved, not erased, not exploited, not forgotten again. They exist in a strange half-life, known, verified, untouchable. A reminder that some stories don't end with a song. They end with silence. And in that silence, Michael Jackson still speaks. The silence surrounding those tapes does not feel empty. It feels intentional, as if the recordings themselves understand that they belong to a space between eras, a corridor where Michael Jackson was neither the man the world already knew nor the figure he would soon become. To step deeper into this story is to step into that corridor, where creativity echoes without an audience and decisions are made that ripple forward for decades. To understand the weight of what Bryan Loren and Michael Jackson were creating in 1990, you have to understand Michael's mindset during that period. This was not a comfortable chapter in his life. Fame had stopped being exhilarating and started becoming isolating. Every move was scrutinized, every lyric dissected, every friendship questioned. Michael Jackson was searching for new collaborators precisely because he needed new mirrors, people who could reflect ideas without reflecting fear. The studio sessions with Bryan Loren were private by design. No press, no entourage, no expectations of immediate release. Michael wanted freedom again, and that tape was perfect for that freedom. Digital, precise, forgiving. It allowed endless experimentation without the ritual finality of analog tape. You could record, rewind, rethink, and start over. That technical detail matters because it shaped the psychology of those sessions. Nothing had to be perfect. Nothing had to be finished. On several of the discovered recordings, Michael can reportedly be heard stopping mid-phrase, laughing, and restarting. In one conversation, he discusses rhythm not as a technical concept, but as a feeling in the body. In another, he talks about how silence between beats can be more powerful than sound itself. These are not comments meant for fans or historians. They are the thoughts of an artist thinking out loud. That is precisely what makes the tapes dangerous from a legal and reputational standpoint. They reveal process, and Michael Jackson's legacy has always been curated around perfection. The Michael Jackson estate understands that better than anyone. From a business perspective, the estate's refusal to purchase or release the tapes is not cruel, it is strategic. Michael Jackson's catalog is one of the most valuable intellectual properties in music history. Every release is calculated, every remix debated, every archival project carefully controlled. Allowing independent recordings, especially unfinished ones, to surface would undermine that control. But from a human perspective, the decision feels heavier. Because those recordings are not just songs. They are moments. Moments that show Michael Jackson unguarded, curious, sometimes uncertain. They show a man wrestling with ideas that would later define an entire decade of pop music. This tension, between preservation and protection, is the emotional core of the story. And it becomes even more complicated when we return to Bryan Loren himself. In the late 1980s, Bryan Loren was on the verge of something big. He had production credits. He had industry connections. And then, suddenly, he was in the room with Michael Jackson. That alone should have launched him into the upper tier of producers. Yet history took a different turn. Some industry insiders suggest that Loren struggled with the pressure. Working with Michael Jackson was not just creatively intense, it was psychologically demanding. Michael worked obsessively. He revisited ideas endlessly. He chased perfection in spirals that could exhaust even the most resilient collaborators. For some producers, that environment was intoxicating. For others, it was unbearable. There is also the possibility of creative disagreement, says one former engineer familiar with that era. When Michael changed direction, he changed completely. Projects could be abandoned overnight if they no longer aligned with his vision. It is entirely possible that the Loren sessions were casualties of such a pivot. Brilliant work rendered obsolete by a new sound Michael felt pulling him elsewhere. But even that explanation doesn't account for total disappearance. Most producers who part ways with a project still protect their work. They archive it properly. They safeguard the materials. They don't abandon them to a storage unit and stop paying rent. That choice, or failure, suggests something more complicated. Financial hardship, personal crisis, legal trouble, none have been confirmed, and Bryan Loren has never publicly explained himself. The tapes, in that sense, are the only witnesses left. They testify not only to what Michael Jackson was creating, but to what Bryan Loren may have lost. As the story broke in December 2024, media outlets treated it like a treasure hunt gone wrong. Headlines focused on the $7 million valuation, the irony of priceless music locked behind copyright law, the tantalizing idea of lost Michael Jackson songs. But beneath the surface, the story resonated because it touched something deeper, the fragility of creative legacy. For every artist like Michael Jackson whose work is meticulously archived, there are countless collaborators whose contributions fade quietly into obscurity. Producers, engineers, writers, names that appear briefly in liner notes and then vanish. Bryan Loren's storage unit became a physical symbol of that disappearance. And Greg Musgrove, unexpectedly, became the custodian of that symbol. Musgrove has stated that he never intended to exploit the tapes illegally. He understood immediately that releasing them without permission would violate copyright law, but he also understood their historical significance. His dilemma mirrors the audience. What do you do when you possess something invaluable that you are forbidden to share? For now, the answer is preservation. The tapes are stored in climate-controlled conditions, their contents documented but not disseminated, their existence acknowledged but restrained. In an age where leaks are common and restraint is rare, that choice feels almost anachronistic. And yet it feels appropriate. Michael Jackson was an artist obsessed with control, not control over others, but control over his work, his sound, his message. He famously shelved completed songs if they didn't meet his standards or fit his evolving narrative. The Bryan Loren recordings may simply be another example of that principle extended beyond the grave. Still, the emotional pull remains undeniable. Fans imagine what those songs might sound like. Would they have changed the trajectory of Dangerous? Would they have revealed a darker, more confrontational Michael earlier than the public ever saw? Would they have humanized him in ways the polished albums never could? Those questions will likely never be answered. But perhaps that uncertainty is the point. Documentaries often promise closure. They uncover secrets, reveal truths, and tie narratives neatly together. This story refuses that structure. It ends where it began, with a door opening, a discovery made, and a legacy complicated rather than clarified. The tapes do not resolve Michael Jackson's story. They expand it. They remind us that history is not a straight line. It is a collection of detours, abandoned projects, forgotten rooms, and choices made under pressure. Michael Jackson's genius was not only in what he released, but in what he left behind. And Bryan Loren's disappearance, whether intentional or circumstantial, becomes part of that legacy too, a ghost in the machine, a missing chapter that refuses to explain itself. In the end, the most haunting aspect of this story is not the music we can't hear. It's the reminder that even the biggest artist in the world created in fragile moments, trusting collaborators who might not stay, building ideas that might never see the light of day. Fame did not shield Michael Jackson from impermanence. It magnified it. Those 16 DAT cassettes sit quietly now, carrying voices from 1990 into an uncertain future. They may never be released. They may never be monetized. But their existence alone has already altered the narrative. They tell us that Michael Jackson was still searching, still experimenting, still vulnerable. And that sometimes the most powerful stories in music history are not the ones we hear, but the ones we're forced to imagine. The corridor does not end there. It stretches further, narrowing into questions that no document, no court filing, no press release can fully answer. And as the story deepens, it becomes less about tapes and laws and more about something far older and more human, how creation survives the people who make it. When Michael Jackson walked into those sessions with Bryan Loren in 1990, he was not thinking about estates, copyrights, or future discoveries. He was thinking about sound, about rhythm, about what the world felt like as the 1990s approached, a decade that would be louder, harsher, more confrontational than anything pop music had known before. Michael sensed it before most people did. He always had. In the DAT recordings, according to those who have been granted limited access, Michael talks about urgency, about the feeling that time was accelerating, about how kids were growing up faster, angrier, more skeptical. These themes would later surface publicly in Dangerous, but here they appear in raw form, half-sentences, unfinished thoughts, ideas spoken before they were safe. This matters because Michael Jackson's public image often hides the labor behind it. The smooth choreography, the flawless vocals, the immaculate production. But those DAT tapes pull back the curtain. They reveal the work, the struggle, the uncertainty. And that is exactly what cannot be released. Because once the world hears an artist thinking, you can never unhear it. For the Michael Jackson estate, that line is sacred. Their responsibility is not just to preserve Michael's work, but to preserve the version of Michael that history remembers. A version defined by intention, not experimentation. By final choices, not discarded paths. This is where the legal argument quietly intersects with an ethical one. Does the world have the right to hear everything an artist ever recorded, or only what the artist chose to share? Michael Jackson was famously private. He controlled access to himself relentlessly, not because he was hiding weakness, but because he understood how easily vulnerability could be weaponized. Releasing those tapes would expose moments never meant for interpretation, judgment, or consumption. And yet the temptation remains overwhelming. Because the recordings do not just capture Michael Jackson the icon, they capture Michael Jackson the worker, the collaborator, the man sitting at a console at 3 in the morning, replaying a beat and asking if it feels right. In one reported exchange, Michael questions whether a lyric is too direct. Maybe they're not ready, he says. That single line, frozen in time, feels prophetic. Because even now, decades later, perhaps the world still isn't ready to hear him unfiltered. As the media cycle moved on from the initial discovery, the story settled into a quieter phase. No lawsuits erupted. No leaks surfaced. No dramatic courtroom showdowns played out on television. Instead, the situation hardened into what lawyers call a stalemate, and what storytellers recognize as a pause heavy with meaning. Meanwhile, speculation around Bryan Loren intensified. Some believe he intentionally walked away, choosing anonymity over the weight of association with Michael Jackson. Others think he may have faced personal struggles that made preservation impossible. A few even suggest he assumed the tapes were protected elsewhere and never imagined they'd be abandoned. But the storage unit tells a different story. Storage units are not accidental. They are chosen, paid for, maintained until they're not. For years, Loren returned to that unit. He kept paying rent. He kept the tapes there. That suggests intention. Then something changed. And that moment, the precise point at which he stopped, is the missing hinge of the entire narrative. Was it exhaustion, fear, disillusionment, or simply life intervening in a way that creativity couldn't survive? We may never know. What we do know is that when creativity is abandoned, it doesn't disappear. It waits. That is what those DAT tapes did. They waited through the rise of digital streaming, through Michael Jackson's death, through the transformation of the music industry itself. They waited quietly, uncomplaining, until someone opened the door. In that sense, the tapes are not tragic. They are patient. They remind us that art is not always meant to arrive on schedule. Sometimes it exists simply to exist. And sometimes being found is enough. As this documentary story continues to circulate, it has sparked a broader conversation about archival ethics, about how much of an artist's unfinished work should ever be heard, about whether discovery obligates disclosure, about the difference between historical value and emotional intrusion. Michael Jackson's case is unique only because of his scale, but the questions apply universally. Every artist leaves behind fragments. Every creator has drafts, false starts, ideas abandoned not because they were bad, but because they didn't fit the moment. To expose those fragments without consent is to rewrite the relationship between artist and audience. And that relationship, once broken, cannot be repaired. Perhaps that is why the story resonates so deeply, because at its core, it is not about music, it is about boundaries. The boundary between private creation and public consumption, between legacy and curiosity, between what we want and what we're allowed to have. Michael Jackson spent his life navigating those boundaries. The DAT tapes show him inside them. And so the story ends where it must, not with resolution, but with respect. The storage unit is no longer abandoned. The tapes are no longer forgotten. Bryan Loren remains absent but not erased. Michael Jackson remains present but protected. The music sleeps. And maybe that is the most honest ending possible. Because some stories are not meant to be finished. They are meant to be remembered. The silence does not break, it deepens. And in that deepening, something else becomes clear. This story was never only about lost tapes. It is about the fragile ecosystem that surrounds genius and how easily it can collapse without warning. Because for every Michael Jackson, there are dozens of names orbiting just outside the spotlight, engineers, assistants, producers, whose lives are forever altered by proximity to greatness, yet rarely protected by it. Bryan Loren was one of those names. To understand the psychological gravity of working with Michael Jackson in 1990, you have to strip away the mythology. Forget the headlines. Forget the moonwalk. Forget the screams of stadiums. Inside the studio, Michael was not a god. He was relentless. He listened obsessively. He replayed bars until the air felt thick with repetition. He chased a sound not because it was commercially viable, but because it felt true to what he sensed was coming. This was a Michael Jackson anticipating the future and being unsettled by it. The late 1980s were a cultural fault line. Hip-hop was rising, youth culture was shifting, authority was being questioned, media was becoming more aggressive, more invasive. Michael felt that pressure early. In the Bryan Loren sessions, he reportedly talked about distrust, about how narratives are constructed, about how truth can be bent through repetition. These were not safe themes in 1990 pop music. Dangerous would later package some of these ideas into polished anthems, but what Bryan Loren captured was the raw material before it was filtered, softened, or strategically framed. In those recordings, Michael is not performing certainty. He is searching for it. That search can be intoxicating for a collaborator. It can also be terrifying. Because when you work with someone who hears further ahead than the rest of the world, you're always slightly behind. You are always trying to catch up to an idea that hasn't fully formed yet. Some thrive in that chaos, others drown in it. There is a reason why so many of Michael Jackson's collaborators describe the experience in extreme terms, either transformative or unbearable. There is rarely a middle ground. Bryan Loren left no public diary, no interview, no memoir, but the storage unit tells us something words never could. It tells us he did not destroy the tapes. That matters. If Loren wanted to erase that chapter, he could have. DAT tapes are fragile, magnetic, vulnerable to heat, moisture, time. Neglect alone can destroy them, but these tapes survived. They were stored, labeled, preserved, at least initially. That suggests attachment. And attachment makes abandonment harder to explain. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is the simplest one. Life happened. Careers stall. Money dries up. Priorities shift. Survival replaces ambition. In that context, a storage unit becomes a burden, not a sanctuary. Rent becomes a reminder of something you once believed in but can no longer afford to carry. If that is true, then the tragedy here is not malice or mystery. It is erosion. Slow, quiet erosion. The kind that leaves no villains, only consequences. When Greg Musgrove discovered the tapes, he became an accidental steward of that erosion. He stepped into a story already shaped by decades of silence, and unlike most treasure hunters, he didn't rush to exploit it. He hesitated. That hesitation is crucial, because it mirrors the hesitation embedded in the recordings themselves. These were not songs rushed toward release. They were paused, held, deferred, and now once again deferred by law. In a culture obsessed with content, more faster now, the restraint surrounding these tapes feels almost subversive. But restraint has always been part of Michael Jackson's process. He was notorious for recording far more than he released. Entire albums worth of material were left on the cutting room floor, not because they lacked quality, but because they lacked alignment. Michael believed that an album should feel inevitable, as if it could not exist any other way. Anything that disrupted that illusion was removed. The Bryan Loren songs may have been victims of that philosophy, or they may have been casualties of timing. Because timing matters. Had these sessions occurred 5 years earlier, they might have shaped bad. 5 years later, they might have been absorbed into HI's story. But in 1990, Michael's identity was in flux, and work created during flux often struggles to find a home. That does not diminish its value, it complicates it. And complication is dangerous in legacy management. Which brings us back to the estate. The Michael Jackson estate is not a villain in this story. It is an institution designed to stabilize chaos. Its job is to protect, not just revenue but narrative coherence, to ensure that Michael Jackson's public legacy remains intelligible, intentional, and defensible. Unreleased material threatens that coherence, because it invites reinterpretation, and reinterpretation invites controversy. The estate's refusal to engage with the tapes is not seen by insiders as dismissal, but containment, a way of acknowledging existence without legitimizing exposure. From a legal standpoint, the case is closed. From a human standpoint, it is wide open. Because fans don't just want music, they want connection. They want to hear Michael Jackson thinking, doubting, laughing, struggling. They want proximity. But proximity is not the same as understanding. And that distinction matters more here than anywhere else. Michael Jackson's life was marked by extreme exposure. By the end, his privacy had been eroded almost completely. To release his unguarded studio moments now, when he cannot contextualize them, defend them, or shape their meaning, would be to repeat that erosion posthumously. The tapes resist that fate. They sit unresolved, asking nothing. And that may be their greatest power. As time passes, the story of the tapes has taken on a mythic quality, not because of what's on them, but because of what they represent. The idea that even the most documented artist in history still has hidden rooms. Rooms we are not invited into. That realization humbles the audience. It reframes fandom from ownership to witness. You are not entitled to everything an artist creates. Sometimes the boundary is the message. In that sense, the Bryan Loren tapes have already changed Michael Jackson's legacy, without a single note being heard. They remind us that Michael Jackson was not a machine producing hits. He was a human being navigating uncertainty, trusting collaborators, making choices that only made sense in the moment. They remind us that creative history is not a straight line toward greatness, but a maze filled with dead ends, wrong turns, and abandoned paths. And they remind us that disappearance, whether of a producer, a project, or a possibility, is part of that maze. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that honor the unseen labor behind legendary art, please take a moment to support the channel. Like this video, Share it with someone who values music history, and subscribe so these untold chapters are never forgotten again.